Right. We've learned that terrible childhoods are a common factor in serial killers and violent criminals and psychopaths. So, why? Why is a terrible childhood? So, social learning theorists like Albert Bandura would say, well, the children learn and copy those violent behaviors they see and experience as a child. Right? That's from the 1960s. And actually, we can use more modern research to support Bandura's other theory, social cognitive theory, which looks at how childhood experiences in what we call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, adverse meaning not nice, not pleasant. So adverse childhood experiences affect the brain. And that's an example of neuroplasticity. And so this could support Bandura's idea of triadic reciprocal determinism, because the environment, which is our childhood environment, and the ACEs, influences the brain, and in particular we're going to look at the amygdala, and then that can affect our behavior. This can also be explained from an evolutionary perspective. So actually you could use the same study, the same research here, to cover two different approaches. And it's really important. We're actually not looking at stress, we're looking at aggression. All right, so let's scroll down here. Sorry, these are my slides. All right, you can actually calculate your own ACEs score if you like, aces2high.com, but of course this is very personal and private, so completely up to you. If you're interested, now your ACEs, your experiences as a childhood don't have to define who you are as an adult. You're not bound to it, and David Goggins is a fantastic example of this. Anyway, this is something we do in the year 13 class. All right, here we get to. Now, ACEs are going to develop and affect the amygdala, and we're going to use this to explain this from an evolutionary perspective. And so what we're going to look at is the studies that have shown kids who are exposed to violence end up having a hyper responsive amygdala, meaning their amygdala respond faster and more and a higher level of activity in the amygdala when they're shown threatening faces in an fMRI. We're going to look at the study that supports that. And we can explain that from an evolutionary perspective. Let's first look at the study, and then I'll explain the evolutionary perspective. But hopefully you'll be able to think about it, right? Evolutionary explanation means, well, how has this allowed us to survive? How does this benefit our survival? If you're growing up in a terrible traumatic childhood, you've got lots of violence around you, you're exposed to lots of violence, you're exposed to lots of adverse things, your amygdala goes on red alert, easy to react, easy to spark. How would that help you to survive? And think about what the amygdala does, not only in aggression and violence, but also in activating the stress response and getting you ready to fight or flight. Hopefully you can see that link. I feel like it's pretty logical, and that's why I like this example. It doesn't add that much more content, but it deepens your understanding. So ACEs increase the amygdala reactivity, right? Meaning your amygdala detects threats, right? Activates when something's threatening you in the environment, and so ACEs are going to increase that reactivity. So, I told a lie, let's start with the evolutionary explanation. If you grow up with lots of threat, it's an advantage to be more aware of those threats, right? So remember, your amygdala will perceive a threatening stimuli, perceive a threat in your environment before you're even aware of it consciously. And so if you're growing up in an environment filled with chaos and violence and things that could go wrong, a violent parent, or you're in a neighborhood filled with violence, then it makes sense for your amygdala to be very tuned in to the threats that could potentially hurt you. That's going to help you to survive. If your amygdala was slow to react, maybe you're slow to react to respond to fight or flight in a situation where it's necessary, and you become more, more likely to be a victim, more at risk, right? So McCrory's simple study, you got kids from London. One of the groups had been exposed to family violence, right? Abuse, physical abuse, corporal punishment, meaning being smacked and hit as a form of punishment. And they compared those to a control group who, same age, same gender, same IQ, same handedness, and but hadn't had exposure to family violence. And they put them in an fMRI and they compared their amygdala. And like what we've seen in other studies, they show them angry or sad faces. They asked the kids to compare the faces, and to rate them, right? So this is kind of what they saw in the fMRI. Okay. Now, what they find, right? So the violence group had a higher activation in their right amygdala when seeing angry faces, but not sad faces. That's really important, right? It's not just that they're attuned; their amygdala activates to all stimuli. It's threatening stimuli. Okay. And that is, suggesting more responsive to threats, right? And this could be a neurological risk factor not only for stress and other health problems, but also for aggression, because anger is generated in the amygdala. And this can support, again, Bandura's triadic reciprocal causation model. Okay, environment, which is the ACEs, influences the brain, which is the amygdala, and that influences our behavior, aggression. Can also be explained from an evolutionary perspective. We've evolved to have our brain adapt to our environment in a way that's going to help us to survive. In this case, you're filled with a childhood. You have a childhood filled with threat. Your brain evolves to adapt to that threat by having a more responsive, hyper-responsive amygdala. Now, this could explain some types of aggression, but not all. So the next step for you after that is to think, well, would this explain the aggression you're going to write about in your particular example? If you're talking about men and women, could you hypothesize, do we have differences in our amygdala? In fact, some studies suggest we do. If you're looking at the question on socioeconomic status, it's important to note that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend to have higher levels of ACEs. That's pretty important. This is all written in the textbook if you would like. All right, I hope that was helpful. And again, pretty simple study, pretty simple finding, but it's useful for lots of topics.